Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today on impact management and theories of change. This is a number one in many of webinars we're holding as per initiative, particularly in light of the COVID-19 situation where we're unable to hold events in real life. We've opted for the webinar series to hopefully deliver the same impact and share the insights and knowledge that we have always been doing since our launch in 2010. Those of you that aren't familiar with the Pearl Initiative, we are the region's only non-profit organisation founded to promote the business case for the implementation of the highest standards in corporate governance, accountability and transparency. This webinar is being held as part of our Governance and Philanthropy programme, which was launched in 2017 and was developed to support corporate and institutional donors striving to become more strategic and impactful in their giving. The series of webinars and workshops that we've been held have all come out of a survey which we held in 2017, identifying the challenges that are faced in the sector. We've curated a series of workshops since 2017 to address and support the ecosystem in addressing these challenges. Obviously, non-profit organisations and many organisations' mission and vision statements are often too broad or aspirational to enable clear decision-making regarding their resources, their resource allocation and trade-offs. Intended impact and impact management and theory of change fill this gap by defining clear, specific goals and showing how the organisation's efforts will create social change. This allows non-profits and other organisations to make strategic decisions about how to use its time, talent and dollars or dirhams to generate maximum social returns. Strategizing using intended impact and theory of change constructs can help organisations to make trade-offs among different programs, activities or investments, plan, design, implement and evaluate current and needed programs, understand how their activities fit within a wider environmental context and mesh with other activities of others, and identify any missing links that are essential to creating its desired impact. It also supports in the communication internally and externally about strategy, priorities and results compared to desired outcomes. We've collaborated with AVPN to deliver this workshop today. They've previously held workshops in Dubai as well, and we've worked closely with them over 2019 and 2020 to build a relationship and address the sectoral needs in the Gulf region. I'm going to hand over to Kevin in a moment, but before I do, I'm just going to introduce Kevin Teo. Kevin is the COO at AVPN. Prior to this, he was a founding partner of Lovells, a social innovation company with offices in London and Singapore. Kevin was previously head of East and Southeast Asia at the Schwab Foundation of Social Entrepreneurship and Global Leadership Fellow at the World Economic Forum. Kevin also had a 9-year stint in the enterprise software arena in Silicon Valley, Irvine and Austin, which included work at 2 Sequoia Capital startups that were acquired by Sun Microsystems and Symantec, respectively. Kevin is a trustee of the Southeast Asian Service Leadership Network, SEALNet, a non-profit he co-founded in 2004. Kevin holds a Master of Gerontology from the Singapore University of Social Science, an MS in Information Networking from Carnegie Mellon University, and an ME Engineering with honours in Computing from Imperial College London. Kevin, thank you so much for agreeing to deliver this workshop for us, and I hope you will find it useful. As always with our workshops, interactivity is going to be imperative in this workshop, so please do use the interactive question setup. All questions will be filtered through to Kevin, and hopefully Kevin will respond those throughout the webinar or at the end. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Yasmin. And thanks again to Pearl Initiative for partnering with us on this webinar. Some quick background on AVPN. We are essentially a funders network based in Singapore, covering all of Asia, and our mission is to move capital towards impact. And by capital, we refer to different forms of philanthropy, impact investing, and ESG investing. And we have currently 625 members from 32 countries, some of which are based in the Middle East. And as Yasmin has mentioned, we've had members as well as prior trips to Dubai to engage with some of our members, and we'll continue to do so in partnership with organizations like Pearl Initiative to promote the growth of the sector. 3 months ago, we had planned to do this particular workshop in person, and one of our members, Hogan Lovells, the law firm, had agreed to host us in their offices. So I wanted to also put out a special thanks to Imran and Nishali, who very generously offered their premises at that time when circumstances were different to actually host this workshop. But nonetheless, now that things have changed, we are looking to engage with all of you on an online format. And we've tried to introduce as much interactivity in this webinar as possible. So I hope your questions are forthcoming. Please use the question panel to send anything that might not be clear to me, and I will address them along the way. The topic for today is impact management and theories of change. And what I'll be covering is, I'll kick it off by talking about what we consider the impact value chain, how different stakeholders in the social investing ecosystem, from resource owners to intermediaries to frontline social organizations, how do they work collectively to engage beneficiaries at the end of the day? I'll use a case study. It's a social enterprise called Krakatoa, based in Indonesia, to illustrate this case. And the overall sort of topic will be broken out into two parts. I'm going to cover first the theory of change component. How do you essentially build a flowchart to help you understand the causal relationship of how change happens on the ground? And then on the second part, I'll look at how funders can work closely with their supported organizations, whether they are charities or social enterprises, to understand the link between the theory of change and how funders can come to terms with impact. And I'll be covering the impact management project as a framework to understand this piece. Okay, so we've added a poll into the system, and I'd like to understand from all our participants today, which of the following best describes your current role? And this will help me sort of orientate the material in the webinar to specifically address where each of you are located within the social impact ecosystem. Okay, the responses are coming in. So just some additional background on the webinars and the training workshops that we typically run. As AVPN is a funders network, we tend to orientate our material towards funders and to understand how funders perceive this space. Okay, I see that about 1/5 of you are in the context of a funder, and you support charities and or social enterprises as part of your daily roles. About another 1/5 run charities or social enterprises, so you're sort of a frontline organization. And quite a few of you selected none of the above. So I'm really curious as to what roles you play. If you see the chat window in the webinar app, please feel free to type in here and sort of indicate some of the roles that you play in your daily jobs. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the next slide on the webinar by covering firstly the impact value chain. So as I've mentioned, AVPN is a funders network. So we perceive the ecosystem of social impact from a funder's perspective. And I just want to illustrate sort of different entities within the ecosystem and how impact flows from resources all the way sort of down the chain towards beneficiaries. And these terms are used to characterize different roles, and I'll provide illustrations within the foundation or NGO sector later, as well as within the impact investing sector. Typically, we have what we call principals or asset owners at the top of the impact value chain. And these are individuals or organizations that have the end goal of delivering impact to address some social need. And these organizations or individuals could engage directly with the beneficiaries, but oftentimes we see that there are entities in between that help with the flow of capital. And with the flow of capital, there is the associated sort of mandates or objectives that are passed along to then achieve the end result. So what we see as a key challenge at the principal or asset owner level at the top of the value chain is because they have a set of resources that tends to be divided up across multiple implementing organizations. Their key challenge around impact management is to understand impact in aggregate. They want to know what is the totality of the impact so that they can guide their own decision making. And if you go all the way to the other end of the chain with the beneficiaries, the key challenge at that end is wanting to know what is the impact in detail. In essence, what is the impact for myself? How are my needs represented? So these two challenges are oftentimes in tension between wanting to achieve the specific impact goals of the beneficiaries versus aggregating information sort of at the top to make sense for these asset owners and to help them guide their decision making. In the case of impact investing, and Sarah, thanks for putting in your response in the question tab. You mentioned that you provide advice to nonprofits as well as impact investors. So here's an illustration on the impact investing front. You typically have the asset owner. We refer to them as limited partners that put funds into impact funds, right? They put capital into impact funds, and these are sort of regarded as general partners, and they subsequently make investments into social enterprises, which then deliver some form of service or product that have benefits for stakeholders on the ground. Similarly, if we look at a grant-making context, you could have an asset owner or the endower of a foundation, the endowment for the foundation, or a board that then provides instruction to the foundation. And the foundation makes grants to charities, which then reach out to beneficiaries. So this is another illustration of how resources flow from the top of the chain and eventually through the operations of all these intermediate organizations benefit the frontline stakeholders. Okay, in the first part of today's webinar, I'll be talking about how a theory of change can be applied to this frontline organization. So this could be a charity or it could be a social enterprise. And for the second part of the webinar, I'll be talking about how do you use the theory of change. And it's important to understand that the theory of change is something that this entity, the frontline social organization, puts together so that it understands its own operations for reaching out to beneficiaries. So as a funder, you're not going to be creating the theory of change to then hand off to the charity to say, run this plan, right? I mean, if you do that, you're better off forming your own charity. And in fact, some foundations are what we refer to as operating foundations. They engage with beneficiaries directly. But if we think about our foundation example here as a grant-making foundation, then this is an organization that provides funds to a charity that then delivers on some good or service to the beneficiaries. So in that case, the charity needs to be in charge of putting together their theory of change. And as the funder, first of all, you need to understand the fundamentals of the theory of change process, and then to use the knowledge of that to inform your own impact management process within the foundation. So I hope all that is clear. Okay, so for today, we'll be using a case study from Indonesia. And I hope all of you like chocolates like me. We'll be talking about a social enterprise in Indonesia that is what they call a bean to bar business. They engage directly with low-income farmers in different parts of Indonesia to help them sort of improve their practices, and at the same time promote environmentally sustainable as well as beneficial approaches so that there is long-term benefits for the farmers and for the product. And as a social enterprise, it needs to be financially sustainable. It needs to be able to sell its products. It needs to be able to pay its staff, cover its marketing costs and distribution costs, and keep that whole process flowing. So for today's case, we will talk about Krakatoa, which has this dual objective of not just benefits for the farmers and the environment, but also it needs to be sustainable to keep the whole thing going. So Krakatoa was founded in 2013, and as I've mentioned, in Indonesia. It operates in several parts, and you can see all these nice packaging over here. All these different cocoa products come from different parts of Indonesia, and they look to benefit smallholder cocoa farmers as well as the environment. And they do this by producing some pretty awesome chocolate that sells to sort of consumers in developed markets. So how Krakatoa operates is, firstly, it identified a set of issues that these farming communities encountered. So first of all, there was the issue around low farm productivity, where the yield of these cocoa products were not as high, and it wasn't leveraging the most advanced methods to produce better yield. The quality of the cocoa products were also not that great, which then didn't help these farmers find access points for their products to the higher profit sort of supply chains. And because of that, they were not able to maximize their own income. And the other issue with these farming communities is, in their attempts to improve their income, they started encroaching into protected rainforests. And these, of course, have negative consequences for the communities around the farms. And of course, as we understand around climate change, there are sort of ripple effects to everybody else. So what Krakatoa does is it gets all these partner farmers to complete an 8 to 16 week workshop on good agricultural practices and sustainable farming methods. And the catch here, and to sort of provide incentive for completion, is that once they are done with the training, then they are provided free farming tools and continued support. And Krakatoa then guarantees them a minimum price for the harvest, which is actually more than the fair trade minimum. Later on, as I go into the numbers for these farming communities, you can see how the farming income had actually improved over the years. So for Krakatoa as a social enterprise, remember the value chain, the impact value chain, as a social enterprise engaging with beneficiaries who are the low-income farmers, they were employing impact assessment on a few parameters. They were prioritizing emissions, sustainability, as well as gender. And of course, they track the income of all these farmers on an ongoing basis. Moving up one notch from Krakatoa on the value chain, you have the funder. And just in July last year, they managed to secure joint funding from a collective of impact investors. And we're using the impact goals from that funding to frame this particular exercise, where for the funding provided, they were supposed to benefit 1,000 smallholder farmers and also provide jobs for 20 female factory workers. Those of you familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, can see a link between this objective and SDG 1, which is the no poverty sort of goal. And they're also, as an organization, Krakatoa was looking to deliver more environmentally friendly farming methods. Going back to the enterprise objective of Krakatoa, this funding from the impact investors was also used to expand the capacity of the organization's production. and in doing so, improve its sales prospects and to help it achieve greater sustainability. Okay, now I will move on to the first part of the webinar covering the theory of change. And as you can see, I think some of you might have seen a theory of change from your organizations. Those of you who run charities or social enterprises, you might have done this before. And those of you who fund organizations would probably have requested that of your recipient organization. In a sense, it is a simple flowchart. And I'll take sort of the next few slides to explain the different steps at arriving at this particular sort of flow. Okay, so just to raise the point again that the theory of change is something that's being done at this level of the impact value chain, where the charity or the social enterprise sits. And if you're a funder, you need to be familiar with the process, and you need to sort of have a set of questions at the back of your mind when you review the theory of change of your recipient organization, the organization that's receiving either the grants or the investments from your organization. Okay, a theory of change is in essence an illustration of how and why a desired change is expected to happen. Yeah, when we talk about impact that is delivered to stakeholders, impact is a change that you expect on either the certain target beneficiary group or the environment sector. We're also looking at understanding the causal linkages between all these different activities that are being delivered by the frontline organization. The theory of change is also dynamic in nature. That means it's not a fixed plan. And those of you involved in the business world or in startups, you probably have done a business plan before. And you would know that even for a business plan, it is the starting plan for the organization, but it's not going to be static throughout. You need to adapt your plan over time as you operationalize the organization and as you encounter challenges. You need to be able to adapt and weave. And in the case of the theory of change, where you are engaging beneficiaries, it is very important to critically examine the underlying assumptions that you're making in terms of this particular plan. So a theory of change gives you a basis for that conversation. Some benefits of the theory of change: it helps you clarify what the potential impact. I think the impact is an obvious part of this particular plan, but also to be clear and to be honest about the risks that underpin this approach as you connect your work to that ultimate end goal. And as I've mentioned before, it also forms the basis for you to engage with stakeholders. Stakeholders could be your beneficiaries, or they could be funders that you derive funding support from. And then we're able to use this theory of change flowchart to link the impact value chain from the funder through the social organization and then to the beneficiary. Okay, I'm going to be describing the theory of change through a series of 6 steps. And if you Google theory of change on the internet, you'll find sort of a whole plethora of resources. This is not something that we created at AVPN. It's a process that's been around and used by the development sector and the nonprofit sector for a long time. I'm using examples that were sort of the process that was put together by the IIIE. And in particular, you see here a link to a YouTube video organized by Professor Howard White, who was the founding ED of IIIE. And what's interesting is because they have done pretty robust impact evaluation work, they've been supported by the Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, and also DFID. And they've got very relevant experience in this impact space. So over the next few slides, I'll be going through these different steps to arrive at that full flow chart that I put up earlier. Okay, so the first step of the theory of change is, of course, to define your intervention. What is the program that we're trying to run? And we need to be precise in terms of the outcome definition, as well as the beneficiaries. The outcome, of course, is what you see at the end of that whole flow, which goes from sort of left to right. And we also want to identify the unintended consequences. I see a question from Kaula in terms of whether the slides will be shared, and yes, we will make them available. I'll send that over to our friends at Pearl Initiative, and we can disseminate that to all of you online today. Okay, so we start off with a set of initial challenges, and remember from the Krakatoa example, we highlighted low farm productivity, poor quality of unfermented cocoa, farmers sort of clearing protected rainforests and sort of encroaching into those areas, and of course, low farmer income as the key challenges. What we're trying to do is to arrive at a set of outcomes around improving their income, protecting the rainforest, and also making sure that the business has grown and is sustainable. Okay, so what we do with the theory of change is we start off with a set of end goals and think about these as long-term goals. And long-term is a contextual thing. What we use as an example oftentimes is a 3-year time frame. In this case, with Krakatoa, because growing cocoa trees actually take time, 3 years is considered a little bit short. So we need to plan for a little bit more. But I'd say anywhere from a 2.5-year to 3-year benchmark is probably reasonable to observe a change. There is one element on the duration, which I'll cover later on, that needs to be sort of relevant to the organization that you're analyzing. So we start off with the final goals, and here we have enumerated the 3. And what we do in the theory of change is we work backwards to where we are today. So to get to these 3 final outcomes, firstly, we want to be able to deliver on these intermediate steps that are before that. Okay, so we want to be able to help farmers sell their beans at a much higher market price. We also need to improve the production life cycle of these farmers, improve their practices so that the rainforest can be protected. And on the business front, we need to address certain sales and marketing programs. Okay. Notice that the way I framed these goals, they are worded in the past tense. Yeah, and this is done deliberately. So we want to be able to say that these things have happened, so that we know when we have achieved a particular goal. And that's why, as a matter of practice, we try to word all these outcomes as well as intermediate steps in the past tense. Okay, so just to move through the steps that the Krakatoa founders have deployed, you can move to the beginning, where to kick it off, we had a set of inputs, the financial capital, the human capital, which is the training that was provided, and the intellectual capital, which is the know-how of the farming practices, were then fed into all these programs and then led to certain outcomes along the way. Okay, so this is a simple illustration of how do you go from a set of final outcomes working back towards the beginning. And the beginning would be something that you would treat as present day. What is the current state of the organization today? Okay, so I'm going to move on to steps 2 and 3. First of all, I'm going to cover sort of what is the causal chain. And some of you might have heard of this term called the logic model. And the second part, I'll talk about what assumptions we have made to deliver on this particular theory of change. Okay, logic model is, you've probably seen a rendering of of inputs to activities to outputs and then outcomes. So this has the same components as the earlier flowchart that I presented, but you realize that by bunching all these boxes into the activities, into the outputs, it's hard to link each individual box to each subsequent step. And as a matter of practice, we sort of discourage the use of this logic model rendering, but rather to work towards more of a flowchart kind of process where you can link every intermediate step to the next stage. Okay, so this is just a quick explanation of the difference between what we consider a theory of change and what you might know as a logic model that is used in some contexts out there. It's important to understand the distinction between the two. Sometimes they are referred to interchangeably as a theory of change, but the way, as you can see, that it's laid out is quite clearly different. And for us, this particular rendering, the logic model rendering, has certain limitations in terms of not being able to discern the causal linkages. Okay, so what I'll do now is talk about the bottom part of the theory of change, that whole chunk where we refer to the assumptions. And remember, one of the benefits of putting this whole plan together is not so much to be stuck to the plan, but to use it as a basis for conversations and to be honest about the assumptions you're making, so that as you engage with different stakeholders, you can get additional meaningful feedback and perhaps even update your plan. Okay, so I'll go sort of column by column through all this just to quickly illustrate where certain assumptions could be overlooked as we are rushing to put together our plan, but where listing them in a theory of change could help with highlighting the gaps. So if we start off with the initial challenges, and in this case, we enumerated this set of 4 challenges around Krakatoa's business model. Some assumptions that come into play are that these issues are correctly identified and that they are the most relevant. Yeah? The relationship between the social enterprise and the beneficiary is something that we need to scrutinize closely, because sometimes, whether it's a charity or it's a social enterprise, these social organizations might be making assumptions on behalf of the beneficiaries. And as a part of our stakeholder engagement process, we need to validate that these are indeed the critical ones to be addressed. Okay, so this is the first step around the challenges. When we talk about the inputs that we put into the plan, the assumption here is that funds are actually available and that we have qualified and motivated staff to actually deliver on these programs, and that there is data available to work with the right stakeholder groups within the farming community. Okay, so as a funder, if you're a funder looking into Krakatoa's theory of change, these are questions that should come up in your mind and that you should be posing to the management team. Okay, and then we move into that whole midsection, which is a jumble of different activities that flow into other outcomes. They all have assumptions built in, and we should be asking at every stage of this process what sort of assumptions are being made and whether they are being sort of qualified. And then we arrive at the final outcomes. So this is where we need to sort of have the clarity as well as the honesty to say between the funder and the recipient organization, whether these goals are indeed aligned across all the respective organizations in the impact value chain. Okay, so this is an illustration of how the theory of change, by enumerating the assumptions at the bottom, allows you to have a more productive conversation. Okay, I see a question from Kara in terms of who should be involved in this theory of change process. In the earlier depiction of the impact value chain, I had the funder providing funds to a social enterprise who then runs the organization and delivers impact to the beneficiaries. The theory of change is something that the social enterprise level or the charity, for those of you in a grant making scenario, would be doing. Okay, so it's not for the funder to do for the charity, but rather for the charity or the social enterprise to do it themselves. And within the team, typically it is a process that is led by senior management. And within the organization itself, sometimes senior management could complete the theory of change entirely. But what we found in our experience is that if you can share that theory of change on as open a basis as possible, clearly you want the rest of your team to be bought in to the objectives, to be bought into the whole process flow, and to also know what is their part within that overall process. So as much as you can share it with your team so that they understand where all this is going, I think would make the process a lot more effective and also to surface gaps within your planning. Okay. Question from Dexter: who audits the impact? Can you, Dexter, if you can clarify that question a bit for me, please? And then I'll come back to that later on. Yeah. Okay. So now that we've put together that whole flow chart, it is important to identify what is the temporal dimension, what is the duration of the applicable plan. And in this particular case, when we're talking about growing sort of cocoa trees in the with the mission of enabling low-income farmers, we have to build in a longer-term time horizon because these trees take a bit of time to mature before the first harvest. Okay, so everything is based on context. I think when you're in the agricultural space, necessarily there is a long lead time to the harvest, but as it relates to other aspects of social service delivery, when we are sort of helping low-income families or working with youth at risk, there could be shorter time horizons where you see the change. So being clear on what is a feasible amount of time before you expect change to happen is important. Okay, so now that we've put that whole flow together with the assumptions and we've considered the time frame to assess our impact, we need to then put on sort of our funder's hat and say what needs to be in place for each step to work. These are key evaluation questions that will come up or should come up. So if you're the management of the social enterprise, you should consider this because you need to be accountable to your stakeholders, which include the funders as well as the beneficiaries. And essentially, we need to talk about what sort of evidence is required to show that a certain impact has happened. We need to talk about where are the sources of information to help us determine if the impact is actually happening. And this fourth point around the contribution is how do we then prove that this particular change was because of our actions? Okay, because in this case of Kakakoa, the farmer's income could have improved anyway because of other circumstances. And there is this element of talking about your contribution. Okay, and this is where we reach the sixth and the final step of putting that plan together. Once we have it in place, we are able to then socialize it with our stakeholders, and these include the beneficiaries as well as your funder. And through socializing it and getting feedback, and for Kara's question earlier on, sharing it with your team, we are able to then update and improve on the theory of change so that we can better deliver on those outcomes. Okay, I'm going to pause here and look at the questions that we have in the webinar window. Okay, how many assumptions, Sean had a question on how many assumptions we should be making without it being too restrictive. I would say, you know, the assumptions guide our planning. So go on the basis of what the team sort of deems as the most relevant high level points to help it make decisions. And of course, you don't want this to be sort of paralysis, analysis by paralysis process where nothing happens because there are just too many concerns. But assumptions are there to be honest and to be sort of clear about how we are moving forward. Okay, and Hashika had a question on what are the most important types of evaluation. Okay, so I won't be covering different types of evaluation, but what I'll be talking in the next part is on the impact management project. And in a sense, the IMP is an overarching framework to think about different sort of existing sort of evaluation frameworks that you may or may not be exposed to in the market. Okay. Okay, so there you have it. This is the combined picture on how do you flow from the final outcomes all the way down to the inputs and the assumptions that we make underpinning all these steps. Okay, feel free to pop up any other questions. Okay, question from Dexter. When the management team reports the impact, specific outputs that achieves the intervention according to the theory of change, does anyone typically audit these metrics? Okay, that's a good question. I will cover this in more detail on the next part around theory of change, around the impact management project. This question about audit and to sort of prove the quality of the metrics is something that you can consider, but of course, this will come at a cost to having that level of rigor. So I would say if you're in a funder or a funding position where you want or you need to ascertain the strength of your investee or your investees' reports, then this might be something that you build into your funding budget so that this can be done. How often do you update the theory of change? Okay, thanks for that question, Lamia. I'd say this is a process improvement kind of framework. So you can do this, some organizations do it every half a year, others do it on an annual basis. The idea is that you need to have this as the basis to decide what is the plan going forward. And then you can also use this as an organization improvement tool to look back on how the plan panned out maybe a year later and to say, these assumptions that we made last year didn't really pan out. And, we were sort of caught off guard by certain assumptions we made that didn't really sort of pan out. So here's how we take all that input in as a matter of improving our own process. Okay, so I'd say at a minimum, you should probably be looking at this every year. And if you find that, for whatever circumstance, for whatever kind of reasons, the assumptions you've made who are way off track, then you should probably be revisiting your theory of change on a more frequent basis to help with your fine tuning. Okay, so at this stage, I'm gonna talk about how do you take that previous exercise around putting together the theory of change, which is the flow chart of how do you deliver on a particular intervention. How do you take that and align it to your impact management as a funder? Okay, so remember, okay, so this part will look at the relationship between the funder and the recipient organization. Okay, so it could be a foundation that funds a charity, or it could be an impact fund that funds a social enterprise. Yeah, it's a sort of essentially kind of a relationship between those two entities, and we're trying to see how to use the theory of change to help improve on impact reporting between these two levels. Okay, so before we move on, I'm gonna pop up the next poll and get a read from everyone on your level of familiarity with the impact management project. Okay, great. Oh, it's good to see that quite a few of you have heard of the impact management project. I'm going to see if I can share these results. Yeah, okay, so the majority of you have heard about it, but may or may not be entirely sure how it works. About a quarter of you have never heard about it, so you're new to this. And then, you know, some of you are familiar with the 5 dimensions of impact. Okay, great. Okay, so the impact management project, and just a recap for those who have heard about it, we consider this development quite significant. It's primarily because you have a big collection of organizations and global organizations in the mix that have come together and have agreed to align their objectives around impact measurement and management. And some of the logos that you see here, you know, they include the UNDP, PRI, SASB, the IFC, and OECD. So these are large organizations that do impact measurement and impact reporting as a core part of their operation. And not only that, we have a large stakeholder group of 2,000 plus organizations, and these include large foundations, asset managers, global nonprofits that have signed on, in essence, to agree to align their impact management approaches. And this is quite fundamental because those of you who earlier on had indicated that you run a charity or a social enterprise, you've probably experienced a situation where you know, you receive grants from multiple organizations, and they all have their own unique reporting frameworks. They all have their own specific reporting questions, and then you end up spending a lot of time doing reporting separately. But you're in essence the same organization, right? So you should be able to sort of do what you do and then account one way to all these organizations. And the fact that there are so many frameworks in the market today points to how impact management as a sector or as an industry needs to be better aligned so that we can take less burden, take the burden off these frontline organizations on reporting and and have them focus their limited resources on addressing the needs of beneficiaries and delivering more impact. Okay, so the impact management project is quite a crucial development in the course of in history of impact management. In the earlier question, I mentioned the 5 dimensions of impact, and what I'll do is, using the Krakatoa example, walk through each of these 5. And those of you who have been sort of scratching your head and trying to understand sort of what is the perfect impact management system you should be using, you know, I've spoken to so many consultants that do evaluation. I've read up so many sort of documents on the internet and try to understand this myriad sort of choice of frameworks out there. You've probably seen different frameworks prioritizing different aspects of these 5 dimensions. So what if there is one key takeaway that you get out of this part, is really to understand what the 5 dimension encompasses, because through the alignment of all those large organizations that I put up previously, we've identified what is the overall landscape of impact reporting needs. So they're all captured in these 5 dimensions somehow. And if you have knowledge of the 5 dimensions, you can then start understanding which aspects are more critical to your work. And then you will be in a better position to assess which frameworks fit the need of your organization because of the unique focus on some or many of these dimensions. Okay. Okay, so if we go back to Krakatoa again, and you know, just putting up this, in a way, this report card based on the 5 dimensions, it could be quite overwhelming to see all this data. Let me just say that the 5 dimensions, as I mentioned, provide you a map to understand the impact management space. It doesn't mean that you have to accomplish all this from the onset, right? If you know what the lay of the land looks like, you can begin your journey on the impact management process and start hitting off a few of the top questions, you know, under the what or the who dimensions. I think these parts you've probably already covered if you're a funder, and then all the other parts around the how much, the contribution, and the risk. Just know that they are there. You may or may not have addressed them yet, but the fact that they exist on this scorecard means that you should have some awareness of what it means to respond to them. And your response will also depend on the resources that you have. So to Dexter's earlier question on who pays for the audit, it really is a matter of how important is that audit. And you know, as I cover the points around how much and contribution later on, there are inherent resource requirements to get answers to those questions. And at a minimum, you should know sort of that these questions exist and that you can decide what is right in terms of resource allocation to get answers to them. Okay, so what I'll do over the next few slides is to cover these 5 dimensions. And within each of the 5 dimensions, there are a set of questions. Okay, so just to give sort of a sense of flow, I'll talk about the 5 dimensions here using Krakatoa as an example. And then later on, overlay these questions that you see in the 5 dimensions into the theory of change so that you can see the dynamic between the funder and the recipient organization, and how a funder needs to sort of have these considerations in mind when they are having conversations with the investee. Okay, so what is the intervention? Essentially, you want to talk about what SDG the social enterprise is addressing. You want to know what is the target outcome. And earlier on, we saw that it was to address low-income farmer needs. And you also want to talk about what is the threshold of representative of being good enough, right? You don't want to say that the farmer's income was at X and provide no context as to whether X is meaningful or not. Okay. And question 4, we talk about how important is this outcome to the stakeholder. So this is where we have done some level of stakeholder engagement to actually validate that the outcome was a meaningful one to be achieved. Okay, so we can overlay all these sort of answers into this what dimension. Okay, so in the case of Krakatoa, the target outcome, and they looked at the monthly income of the farmers. They achieved monthly income of USD 180, and the threshold that they set for themselves was USD 120. Okay, so this is based on sort of survey data in the agricultural communities that they worked in. Okay, so you can see that by setting a threshold of 120 and then exceeding the threshold by achieving a target of 180, this is actually a positive achievement. Okay? And when we talk about how important is this outcome to stakeholders, you can do this through a survey mechanism. Okay, then we talk about who is experiencing this outcome. So I used the description of low-income farmers and low-income farmers in Indonesia. But Indonesia is huge, right? It's a collection of 18,000 islands. We need to be a bit more specific as to where these farmers reside and where do they operate. Okay, so these questions will allow us to go into some level of specificity on who is the target beneficiary. Okay, so there is a district in West Sulawesi called Saludengan in Indonesia, where Krakatoa had looked to deliver this specific intervention. Okay, the baseline of the stakeholders. So when they came into the program, what was their starting salary? Because you need to be able to say that this was the change that the program had delivered to the beneficiaries. So having a sense for the baseline, what was the starting value? And in this case, it was 80 USD, to then look at jumping up to 180. That was a substantial change. Okay, and of course, you can add in other unique stakeholder characteristics. Okay, and then talk about how much change is delivered for these stakeholders, right? You want to talk about the specific number of farmers that you've touched and what is the depth, what is the specific change that happened within their context, and what is the duration of the impact. Okay, so this is the how much dimension, the third one. Okay, contribution. Let me just preface this section by saying that contribution, when you talk about what would have happened anyway, is quite a difficult dimension to assess. And in some cases, those of you who have heard about randomized control trials are aware that if you have a control group and you work with a separate group that received the intervention, you can make some level of attribution to how the program has benefited this group. And organizing all this is going to be resource intensive. So you need to understand if this is a critical part of the evaluation. And if you're a social enterprise, then this would be a conversation that you need to have with your funder to understand if this is actually critical information that needs to be derived. Okay, so the contribution dimension is to address sort of the counterfactual of what would have happened anyway, saying that the farmer's income has improved from a certain baseline to a target amount, and sort of crediting your intervention for that. Yeah, I think that's the key part of this dimension. Okay. So I've left this is sort of the compilation of the report card. I'll spend a bit of time separately on the risk dimension, because risk is also sort of separately a set of considerations that could be quite tricky to assess. Okay, so I see a question from Sophia about what is the main difference and use case between the TOC and IMP. So I'll come to that in a bit. Just to sort of reiterate the earlier point, these two are indeed separate methods. The TOC is something done at this level, the charity or social enterprise level. These are the frontline organizations that are delivering programs. And it makes sense for them to put together their theory of change to clarify what are they doing as activities to then have a measurable impact on the beneficiaries. The funders, the foundation, needs to understand how a theory of change comes together, but is actually not in charge of putting together the theory of change. Yeah, I hope it makes sense that if the foundation does put together a theory of change, then they might as well be running those programs themselves. And there are circumstances where we have operating foundations that have the resources and they run their own programs. So they could actually consolidate everything into one entity. Okay, so at this stage, I'm gonna sort of very quickly draw a link between the IMP and the earlier steps of the TOC. Okay, so the IMP is the 5 dimensions of impact is something that that I would say funders need to be aware of and consider when they think about their evaluation approach. The frontline organizations, so charities or social enterprises, should also be aware of the IMP so that they know what is the totality, that whole map that I described earlier on around impact management, and be in a position where they are prepared to answer questions from their funders. Okay, so remember earlier on when I covered step 1 of the theory of change in defining the intervention, you can see how IMP questions 1 to 8 sort of speak to the whole definition of the intervention, right? This represents the what category as well as the who category. Okay, so if you're putting together a theory of change and if you're bearing in mind what your funder might be thinking in terms of their own considerations, then you should be going through all these questions and finding answers for them within your theory of change. Okay, in step 4 of the theory of change, I mentioned the temporal dimension, right? What is the evaluation time frame for that particular plan? Okay, and this is represented by question 11 of the IMP, which is the duration of the impact. Okay, you can start seeing how the theory of change process maps meaningfully into the IMP framework. Okay, in step 5, where we need to look into our evaluation questions for ourselves in putting together the theory of change. These relate to IMP questions 9, 10, 12, and 13. If we contemplate these IMP questions on what is the scale, what is the depth of the intervention, as well as how do we prove the contribution of our solution to a particular outcome, then this will help us address the key evaluation question aspect of the theory of change. Okay, so I'm going to pause here in case there are any questions on this attempt to draw a linkage between the theory of change process and the IMP questions, and also go through some of the questions that you've submitted in the chat window. Okay, Hashika had a question on the TOC. So how can foundations make their TOC based on various charities' TOC and causes they support? Yeah, I think the foundation's TOC is going to be a broader objective. So this is where there was that impact value chain, right? As a foundation, it's got a broader mission and it needs to aggregate the results of its sort of funded entities under that particular mission statement. So a foundation's theory of change could encompass the set of all these IMP questions around what is the intervention that the foundation wants to support, and who. I think the who question is a critical one to answer for the foundation in terms of which are the stakeholder groups that it's seeking to address, and then the how much and the contribution, those are parts that will be fulfilled by the recipient organization. Okay, Fifi had a question on who should cover the cost of impact evaluation and how should the evaluation be conducted. Yeah, so I'd say this is a discussion between the funder and the recipient organization. The cost of the impact evaluation really depends on what is the depth of the evaluation required. If I move up to sort of the scorecard page, okay, so looking at this IMP framework, if we contemplated the what and the who categories, I think these components here should be something that a charity or a social enterprise are in a position to answer quite readily. I mean, if they have put together a program to deliver a certain form of impact, then all these metrics should be the immediate ones that they track. The question of when impact evaluation becomes more expensive, I would say it comes about when you look at the how much and the contribution questions. So this goes into a bit of a discussion and possibly negotiation between the funder and the enterprise in this case as to whether that piece of information is truly critical, and if so, is it worth the resource to get an answer to that. Okay, so there's no cut and dry answer here. I think it's an open conversation between the funder and the enterprise. Okay, Sonali had a question on whether a grant manager should utilize the IMP framework on a day-to-day basis when monitoring a grant. I don't think it's day-to-day. I would consider this more of a report card, and you can look at what is a meaningful sort of duration for checking in on the report card, and that duration would be determined by this how much attribute. Yeah. So if we know how long it takes for an impact to materialize, then we're in a better position to define the granularity of the reporting. So in this case, where Krakatoa is looking to grow the cocoa trees and to harvest them, they're not going to see anything for the first 3 to 5 years, right? Except that maybe the trees are still growing and surviving, but the essence around improving incomes only becomes pertinent when a harvest is available. So that comes in on the year of maturity. So after that, for cocoa trees, and those of you who, it might be a fun fact, you can actually harvest cocoa trees twice a year. So I would say the reporting granularity there would probably make sense to have it twice a year to see what is the yield and how did that translate into improved income. Okay. Okay, I know I've covered quite a lot of stuff here around the IMP. I'm just going to very quickly sort of run through the risk category. And I would say sort of upfront that this risk section is probably not something that a lot of charities or social enterprises confront immediately, right? When you put together a plan to execute a program to deliver on certain positive outcomes, you're not going to be bogged down with how this plan can fail in so many different ways, right? But oftentimes this is sort of the set of questions that are top of mind from a funder's perspective. The funder will want to know what sort of risk would confront the organization and how can they make sure that the funding is actually producing a positive result at the end of the day. And To the earlier point of how IMP has aligned all these different stakeholders, all these different funding organizations that are thinking about impact reporting constantly, they've cataloged a whole set of risk categories that you can just use offhand. Like I mentioned earlier, you might not need to have a plan to address the risk, but you should know what the risk is about so that you can think about whether it is feasible to address. Okay, so back to the analogy of having a map to work with. This gives you a bit of the lay of the land on all the possible questions that could come up. You need to know where the gaps are, where you could be exposed, and then to at least think about whether you want to have a proactive plan in place or not. So firstly, we talk about the type of risk, and those are all the boxes in green. And then from an operational standpoint, you can think about what is the level of risk in simple sort of low, medium, high terms. So I think at that basic level, you need to have some understanding of how your organization is exposed to these risks. And then the subsequent step of whether you proactively put a plan in place, that's entirely up to you. Okay. Okay, so I've gone through the different points of the impact value chain. We're using a case of Krakatoa to illustrate how a theory of change can be put together by the frontline organization, in this case, a social enterprise, and how the theory of change aligns to the impact management project. I hope this has been somewhat clear in terms of explaining firstly how the steps of the TOC come about, and also how the impact management project is laying out a whole series of questions to help with understanding different dimensions of impact. Okay, let me just quickly go through other questions that have come up in the chat window. Rob, there was a question from Rob on whether funders generally expect or ask for a certain weightage across the 5 dimensions. Nope, there isn't a general expectation that we're aware of. I think the what and the who dimensions are the basic ones that need to be addressed. And then the others around the how much, the contribution, and the risk, I would say those are dependent on available resources to fulfill. Okay, let's see. Yes, Francesca, this is a very good point. In the theory of change, let me just flash back to that slide. Okay, many slide transitions here. Okay, in this theory of change, we have outlined 3 outcomes. Okay, so Francesca's question was, there was a social dimension, which is the farmer's income increasing. And we've also mentioned the environmental dimension, which is the rainforest protected. But in the IMP, we only delved into the details of the first outcome, which is the farmer's income increasing, right? Okay, so let me pull up that scorecard. That's a very good observation. What this IMP framework allows you to do, and notice at the top here where I've highlighted, this is impact 1, which is the farmer's income has increased. You can use this matrix to enumerate sort of separate columns. So imagine impact 2 could be around the environmental considerations. Okay, and impact 2, of course, will have different responses around what is the SDG target, right? Impact 2 could be under SDG 12, which is responsible production, because it talks about, smallholder farmers producing their goods with minimal impact on the environment. It could have a different threshold in terms of what is the measure, the amount of forested space that is being touched, and so on. Stakeholder type, the environment is a stakeholder, that we consider that. And all these other questions on the how much and contribution will have different considerations. So this IMP framework of what we call impact category, there are 15 of them here, can be applied in sort of additional columns to help us capture all the separate impacts that a particular organization is delivering on. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. Okay, Sarah had a question on what are the recommended next steps to deepen our understanding of the practices you've introduced today. On the theory of change, I mean, we'll be sharing these slides, so please feel free to review them. On the theory of change, I had shared a YouTube link, so please take a look at that YouTube video from Professor Howard White, and he'll explain that process using his own example. I think he's done that quite clearly. And on the IMP 5 dimensions, I would encourage you to look up the Impact Management Project. So their website is here, impactmanagementproject.com. And there is a lot of resources around how do we put this whole framework together, and how do we make sense of different approaches that other organizations have used. Okay, so I hope that helps answer your question, Sarah. There is sort of a follow-on piece, which maybe in partnership with our friends at Pearl Initiative, we can talk about for a future webinar. Notice that we discussed the link between the foundation and the charity. Right? We use the TOC to describe the perspective of the charity, and we use IMP to sort of highlight what a funder's view of impact looks like. There is yet a higher level perspective, which is the asset owner and the board. So imagine if you need to make sense of all these multiple IMP assessments and come to an aggregate sort of result on whether your funding or your investments are delivering the kind of impact that you're looking for. The IMP website has materials that shares some case studies on how various asset owners or limited partners have thought about the way they manage their portfolio. Okay, so they have a set of resources, they have a set of funds which they are distributing to multiple impact funds, and multiple impact funds are then investing in social enterprises. So a lot of activity is happening. How do these asset owners at the aggregate level consolidate all that information and make sense about that, so that they know if their plans are moving as they expected, or whether they should start shifting their plans. So these are things that we can talk about for a future session. Sonali had a question on whether certain types of interventions are more suited for impact measurement evaluation. I think this also goes down to sort of a point around efficiency. I think impact measurement can be applied to any form of intervention. The question is, what will it cost to give you a result? And in some cases, it can be very expensive to derive clear feedback from beneficiaries, or feedback from what you need to observe before you can tell if impact has happened. And there are many cases of the abstract nature of impact, like mental wellness or well-being and stuff like that. So these could be expensive to measure or to assess, and tricky to help funders arrive at a certain conclusion. But as more organizations are in this space delivering interventions and sharing their theories of change, what is heartening is the fact that how these organizations are sharing their models with one another, and not only the models but also the metrics. Because if we can do more sharing around what you see in this column here as the indicators. And as we start working towards common indicators, and there is a separate sort of development that we talk about around IRIS Plus, which is run by the Global Impact Investing Network. That's an attempt at trying to form alignment around indicators. So as indicators start aligning, we're able to better benchmark our work with one another. And it becomes, in a way, more productive to help with our own planning, and evaluation will hopefully be less expensive. Okay, Harshika, any cheaper, quick, or dirty ways to measure the contribution aspect of the IMP? I think the contribution aspect is a fundamentally tricky one. So the quickest way is to have a control group. So if you were delivering an intervention, you could split your target beneficiary group from into two different buckets, where one gets it and one doesn't get it, and do your baselining at the beginning to say where were they all at the beginning, and after the intervention, how did change happen for these two groups. I mean, there are some kind of moral hazards to this, because in a way you are withholding an intervention from a group that rightfully needs it. So these are things that you have to take into consideration, and they're not easy questions to answer. Yeah, but that's one basic way of helping you assess whether a contribution has happened. Okay, I see I'm nearing the end of our time slot, so I want to just quickly share this last slide with everyone. Okay, a lot of transitions here. There you go. Okay, so every year at AVPN, we run a big annual conference in Singapore. But this year, in light of the current situation with COVID, we are unfortunately not able to have our regular convening. So what we've done is we've moved our conference online. And this will happen in the week of 8 to 12 of June. Please check out conference.avpn.asia. We are quite excited about the program that we've put together, and we'll be sharing more of that in a bit. There will be very interesting sessions among our members on the different sort of domains that they are actively working on, and we'll be covering the power of networks. How do all these members collaborate, not only members, but other stakeholders in the ecosystem? How are we working better together as a combined community? How can we share challenges and best practices so that we're all more efficient in delivering the outcomes that we want? So please do take a look at that, and we hope that you can join us. Okay, so at this stage, I'm going to turn it back to Yasmin or Sanjay. Okay, so I guess I'll sort of do the final words here. Okay, thanks, Sanjay. Okay, so thanks again to Pearl Initiative for the outreach on this webinar, and having all of you join us and being engaged. I see the engagement meter has been tracking, and all of you have been following diligently. So I hope the points around the theory of change and IMP make sense. And as promised, we will share the slides. Please do check out the conference webpage at AVPN and join us if you can. And we look forward to engaging with you for future sessions. Thank you for your attention.